We are here today with Patti Groessl at the Lakeside Inn in Whitehall. And this project is this video is being done for the White Lake Environmental History Project. My name is Tanya Cavala. I'm doing the interview. And I want to note also that Terry Hampel helped us get ready for this interview and identified Patti as someone to interview. And then Oscar Oswald is handling the video today. And second, we'd like to know if you have read the legal release and signed it.
Yes, I have.
Well, thank you very much. And Patti, would be good to start with a little bit about you in the White Lake area. What's your connection? How did you get here? And a little bit about your family history and you know how that relates to Lakeside Inn.
Well, I was born and raised here in the, actually in between Muskegon and Whitehall, in the Duck Creek area, and right actually where the Michigan Adventure is. And so I've spent my whole life, except the time I was away at school, here, and went to high school in Whitehall High School, and then in 1964 married Jack Groessl, whose family was owned and operated Lakeside Inn. So that's how I came to be involved in Lakeside Inn. And Jack's mother was very happy that he chose me as a wife because I was teaching school at that time. And she thought teaching would be very good combination with running a resort because I could teach in the off-season and then work at the resort in the summertime. So that worked out well for all of us.
Do you want to say a little bit about Lakeside Inn's history?
Sure. Lakeside Inn has a very rich history, and which, by the way, I have chronicled in this lovely book right here. I decided to write a book about the history of Lakeside because I had a lot of it in my head, and my children were the next generation, and they knew some of the history, but they didn't know all the history, and I had all the pictures and all, so I decided to put it all together in this book, On the Shores of White Lake, Reflections of Lakeside Inn, and that is available at Lakeside here to purchase. But I decided to write that because this area has such a rich history, particularly in the resort area. But the Lakeside site here was started in 1898 by the Mason family. And there are still Mason relatives living in the White Lake area. But George Mason bought this property. It was a sawmill. And in fact, if you go looking just beyond where I'm sitting here out to the waterfront, you will see the remnants of the long ago sawmills that were here, because what they did was in order to ship the lumber back to Chicago, they had to square the logs. And to square the logs, they had to cut the sides off. And to cut the sides off, what they did with all the remnants of it was just pitch it in the lake, and that was part of maybe the first pollution for our area, because there are layers and layers and layers and layers of wood from the sawmill out front. Sawmills, because there were many mills in this area. So the Mason family bought this site, and they started with a general store and post office, the Michelinda post office, and then it grew to renting a few rooms out and became more prosperous, particularly as the boats came from the Chicago area or other points to bring tourists to this area, because many people had some homes over on Sylvan Beach, so they would come and other people would come to this area just because they wanted to get out of the hot cities and come to the wonderful, cool countryside of Michigan. And so the Masons began renting rooms. They built some rooms on the top and on the back, and it just gradually got bigger. And then in 1917, Gertrude Talent and her husband, and I'm just trying to think of his name right now, and I can't think of his name, but they bought this from the Mason family. And so that was, they ran it until the Groessl family. So the Lakeside Inn site here as a resort has only been in 3 families for almost 120 years, so a long time. And the Groessl family came to this area in the late 1930s. And they came because their son, Bud Groessl, was at a Boy Scout camp here. And that's how they discovered this area. They came from Chicago on the boats and came to the area. And what they did when they brought their son, they just fell in love with this area and decided then to buy this resort. And that was in 1939. So Lou Groessl owned a bar in Chicago. And the bar, Anne was not too keen on bars. She was a fairly religious woman and was very conflicted about her husband having a bar. So they were very happy, she was very happy, when they decided to move here, sell the bar, and then run the resort. They had some very hard years because sometimes it was feast or famine. They bought it in 1939 and had to build the business because the resort business, like any business or almost any business, waxed and waned over the years. The Depression of the late 1920s affected the resort business, and it was just starting to come back during that time. So they gradually added more motel units and developed the area. In 1945, Bud and Bee Groessl came to join Bud's mother and dad. Bud was an only child, and they brought their son Jack, who was an only child. And he was about 3 then. And so there were 2 generations running the inn, and it really flourished. It flourished in the 40s and in the 50s and in the 60s. And I came on the scene in 1964 when I married Jack. So that's a brief kind of synopsis of the inn and how we all came here. And now, incidentally, my son operates it. So my son is the 4th generation Groessl to operate it. He took it over in the late 1980s, and he runs it with his wife Jody, Todd and Jody Groessl, and they have 2 children who are the 5th generation Groessl. And if anybody comes around Lakeside now, they will see Jackson, their son, who is 13. He'll be 13 shortly. And he's helping out, doing all kinds of things. So,
well, when did you maybe describe some of your earliest memories of White Lake?
Well, the earliest memories were when I was a teenager, and I would have friends who belonged to the yacht club or had boats, and so I would come and go out in a boat with them or play in the water or sometimes go ice skating. And of course the Ark was right out in front of Lakeside, and I started dating Jack Groessl in high school, so I was down here, and perch fishing was a huge thing, although I never did it then. but that was part of knowing about about the lake, was how important fishing was.
Can you describe the ark that was moored out at the end of the road?
Yes, yes. In fact, almost directly behind me was the ark, and it was actually quite a large building, one-story building that was on big barrels. And the person who built it, his last name was Sherman, and Earl Sherman, and then Bob Benner ran it for years and years and years. And they had these 55-gallon drums. I don't know how many they must have had, but they must have had hundreds of them to hold up this building. And when you went in the building, there were these big holes, and that people in the winter could ice fish through, and in the summer any season could fish through. And then Mrs. Benner, I don't remember when the Shermans owned it, but when the Benners owned it, Mrs. Benner had a little kitchen there, and she made the most wonderful hamburgers in there. And so she would serve beverages and hamburgers to the fishermen. So it was a very popular spot. And Dave Benner is their son, and he still lives locally. And I remember him telling a story about the end of the ark, of why it ceased to be. And if I'm right, I think it was in the early 60s, but I'm not exactly sure on the date on that. But there were some it was moored by these very thick wires to the beach. That's how it kept from going all over the lake. Well, there was a very bad storm, and so the ark got loose, and it was headed toward the channel, and it was damaged very much, and so that was the end of the ark. But it was really a wonderful landmark. And if you come to Lakeside Inn, you can see we have pictures of the ark in various places, and it's a wonderful bit of history, the White Lake history.
Well, when you first started operating Lakeside with your husband, were you aware of the chemical companies in the area?
Yes, yes. In fact, I first learned about it when I was in high school. And one of my good friends in high school was named Peggy Groessl, and she and her family came from Louisville. And they came because her father was working at DuPont. And he was a plant manager, a chemist, or something, I don't recall. But Peggy became one of my good friends, and I would go over to her house, and they had a beautiful house, and the parents were very educated. And so I thought, the chemical company, it was very, very nice that they were bringing some of these people to our area. And of course, at that age, I didn't know much. After I married in 1960 and was at the inn and renting rooms, then it was very nice to have the chemical companies, because for the most part, particularly Hooker Chemical, would have group meetings here. They would have they would house people, so they would take a lot of rooms, and particularly in what we would call our off-season or our shoulder season, which was in May or June or September, October, and they would rent rooms. So, of course, that meant money for us and money in our local economy, and so it was very nice. So in the beginning, I had very positive feelings about the chemical companies.
When did you first start hearing about pollution issues related to White Lake?
In a couple different ways. One, in the newspaper, the White Lake Observer, and in that, Darwin Bennett wrote editorials, wrote articles about the pollution when Dahlstrom was very active and very verbal in the letting people know about what's going on in the area. And so mainly through the Beacon, or I think it was called the Observer back then, that was where I first learned about it. Then what happened is we would have a very loyal group of people that came from the Montague side of White Lake, and they would come to dinner often, maybe as much as once a week, and they began talking about what was happening over there. And part of it was in Blueberry Ridge area where they had so much pollution, but they were more aware of the pollution than we were on this side, because for the most part, I'd read about it in the newspaper, but that would be about it. But the people there who would come, they would come over by boat for dinners, or they'd drive all the way around the lake, but they came and they started doing a lot of talking about the amount of pollution that was going on. And so it was a gradual awareness, although I have to admit that back in those days I was very naive about it, because I liked the business we had here from them. And it's also kind of that bit of that mentality of you look out into the water and it looks pretty clear, and so that naivete was alive and well.
Did you ever see any visible effects of pollution in the lake, or smell any chemical smells in the air or anything like that?
None that I noticed. But here's another piece. Let's see. When the pollution was at its worst, well, yes. As far as seeing anything, I never really saw anything. But the thing is that we got the reminders about don't eat the fish, and of course the people who were coming here to vacation would read about things too. And then when Love Canal came along, and all of the tragedy of Love Canal, and then pretty soon what we saw was White Lake and Whitehall in Montague, Michigan was being paired in with Love Canal. And that's when we started feeling the effects of it at the resort, because people would call and say, wait a minute, I just read this story. Is this true? What's happening there? Can people swim in the water? Can they eat the fish? And what we had done actually in the late 60s was build a swimming pool, because before even pollution was a huge matter, a lot of people that would come to Lakeside would be from the cities, and they were less likely to swim in the water, in the lake. That the children had grown up swimming in pools, and they were used to pools. And so we put in a pool, and so that was good, because when the message started being more out there in terms of the news, and people were aware of that, we would say, well, if you feel uncomfortable swimming in the water, you can swim in the pool. And so they would do that, or you can go over to Lake Michigan. We're close to Lake Michigan. But then we did say, personally, we wouldn't eat the fish. There's a recommendation, don't eat the fish. So we would tell them. But then we'd also say, but you can sit on the shore and you can look out at the water, and it's still very beautiful and picturesque and enjoyable, and cool breezes, and try to play up the other natural elements that we have.
Do you think it affected the message or the information about the pollution, and the pollution itself affected your business?
Yes, it definitely did. There were many things that kind of came together in the 1970s. People started changing patterns with how they how they vacationed, or I should say the 1980s really is when it began changing quite a bit. In the 1980s, people were taking shorter vacations. They were camping more. They were doing a bunch of different things. And there were many more resorts and big fancy ones rather than the older resorts that have been here forever. So many things came together, plus all the negative publicity that occurred with the lake made a significant difference in the late 70s and early 80s.
How did you, what was your understanding of the pollution problem? Did you realize what was happening, or was it more, in the background, the actual pollution concerns?
Well, I think about a couple things to answer that question. One is that, again, I was much younger and much more naive. And I trusted that people who were in charge were doing what they were supposed to be doing. And I'm much more jaded now and realize that that really doesn't happen often. But so I trusted that our people who were in our local government and our state government were handling things and taking care of what needed to be taken care of. I trusted that the chemical companies said, well, we're going to take care of that, we're going to get that all straightened around, and that they actually do that. So I had much more of an act of faith than I would ever have at this point in my life. And so that's changed. But in the beginning, yes, it was, oh, well, they're going to take care of that, and they're going to change things.
Did you, how did you feel about it? Was it something that made you angry or anxious or upset, or?
In the beginning, I was kind of mediocre about it, because I thought, oh, well, okay, yeah, there's some pollution going on, but, well, okay, yes. And so I was kind of neutral about it, but then as the information came out, and as the pictures came out of what was happening, and for Darwin Bennett, the things he did in the newspaper, I mean, it was very courageous of all the things he took on this battle. And I know Wynton Dahlstrom was very active in that. But one of the things that struck me I think that was a real powerful awareness was when Darwin Bennett, in the Observer or Beacon, whatever it was called at the time, published the paper, and where he was going to write a story about the chemical companies and the pollution, he left it all white space. And he said, I have been threatened if I publish this, and so he left that blank because he had had so many threats for his well-being, for his wife. I'm not sure what the extent of the threats were, but that impacted me greatly, and I thought, then there is a lot to this story.
Were you aware of any people who were participating in local protests, and have any feelings about that?
Yes. I was very grateful that people were doing that. Very grateful. I was grateful for the local people, Wynton Dahlstrom, a group of people. I mean, obviously you in later years, Tanya, all you've done, but very grateful that people spent time in their lives and made this a cause for our whole community. I mean, that is a real gift to our community.
Did you, at any point, did it make sense for you to take any action, to write any letter, or join the local protest, or was it more challenging as a business owner?
You know, what happened to me during that time was, during the height of it, was that I did write a letter, and in retrospect, I wish I would have done more, but I didn't. I wrote a letter to Guy Vanderjack, who was our senator at the time, just emphasizing the importance of all that needed to be taken care of here and his attention to it. But I just wrote one letter, and I didn't join any groups at the time. I've got all kinds of excuses, but they're just excuses. And again, in retrospect, I would have.
Well, and we've talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people did just talk about the fact that they were different times. Information was not as available, and not everybody maybe felt like they could speak up. Did you know any workers and talk to them about some of the concerns that arose and what they thought about, because they worked at the companies?
I never talked to them about the company, because the workers that would come and stay, and so I wouldn't engage them in that kind of discussion, because I would think that it would be just too conflictual for them, so I didn't. And as far as local people that worked there, none of them were my close friends, so I really didn't know. But what I would hear, again, would be people coming into the dining room and talking that they talked to so-and-so and this was happening, and so I would hear it secondhand or third hand.
What did you think about the companies as far as their the problems with pollution and then the eventual cleanup?
Well, I think it's a sad tale for companies, the irresponsibility, and it's the bottom line, it's profit, it's profit, it's profit. And obviously now in 2013, we deal with this all the time in the news of just real tragic things going on in the world. And so the fact that they were held responsible for it, that was the important part. And I think that is such a powerful message.
What do you know about the status of White Lake now, as far as how healthy it is, or what needs to be done?
Well, I was on the Grand Valley boat with you, Tanya, last summer, and had a tour of the lake and the differences of what has happened in the cleanup of White Lake. And my husband and I were just amazed with all that has happened and the differences in the fish and the life in the bottom of the lake. It was truly amazing, and so it's a wonderful thing.
What do you think? If there were any lessons to learn from this, what do you think we've learned as a community?
One, not to trust so openly. And secondly, to really do the homework. And because I remember very well when they were coming into our area and people were so excited about the thought of jobs and what it was going to mean. And all this is wonderful, and it's a wonderful package, but sometimes things are too good to be true. And being able to do research to really understand what is the full story, I think, is the lesson to be learned on that.
What do you see, what do you think White Lake's future will be like?
Well, I think with people like you that are real activists, that I think the future looks very good. And people are so much more aware now and much more educated. back then it was word of mouth or it was in the newspaper, but now all we have to do is go to our computer and read, and we can find out so much information, and that makes making decisions about things much more informed.
Is there anything you would like to add that I didn't ask you?
I can't think of anything. I just appreciate being included in this and including the resort of Lakeside Inn in this. You know, at one time there were almost 30 resorts on White Lake. And I mean, I know that's pretty amazing, but all the way around the lake. And now Lakeside Inn is the only one that's left.
Well, it was a pretty important part of our history, the resort era, and certainly appreciate your perspective and your agreeing to be interviewed.
Thank you.
So thank you, Patti.
You're welcome.